Logical reasoning is the most important section of the LSAT because it comprises 50% of the test. In other words, if you get one more question right on average per LR section, you're adding an average of 2 points to your raw score.
Or not. On the May LSAT-Flex test, for the first time in LSAT history, all 3 sections will be weighted equally.
If you're scrambling to adjust, this is the episode for you.
Welcome to The Legal Level, a podcast from LSATMax. I'm Jelena.
And I'm Branden. We're your companions on the road to the legal field, whether you've just started thinking about law school or you've already passed the bar.
What are you, a lawyer?
The Legal Level is available from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and wherever you're listening to it right now.
If you like today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and tell a friend.
After you're done listening, if you still have questions about today's topic, you can talk about it with a 99th percentile LSAT instructor by texting LSAT to 310-818-7743. Or, if you'd like your question to be on the show, just email podcast@testmaxprep.com and we might answer you on the air.
Today we're talking about how you can quickly boost your section scores on the 2 non-LR sections of the LSAT in advance of the unusual May LSAT-Flex test. But first, let's check in on what's new in the world of the LSAT and the law.
Well, LSATFlex is still the biggest news out there for future law students. Due to a technical issue on ProctorU's side, LSAC had to push back the sign-up date for May LSATFlex testing times to Monday, April 27th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or 9 a.m. Pacific.
LSAC says they have complete confidence in ProctorU's ability to administer the at-home LSAT. Still, students are definitely a little unsettled by the fact that there are system problems happening just a few short weeks before the test.
Another group dealing with uncertainty right now? Global students who hope to apply this cycle. Global test takers aren't invited to LSATFlex. The next opportunity to take the LSAT outside of the US and Canada is in June, and depending on the state of the pandemic, that could easily get canceled too.
And even if everything goes as scheduled in June, it'll be too late for most test takers to apply for fall 2020 admission to U.S. law schools. So, unfortunately, this probably means some international students will be shut out of the current cycle.
One bit of good news for the law student community: David Latt, founding editor of the popular Above the Law blog, is continuing to recover well from COVID-19 after 17 days in the hospital. We wanted to take a moment to wish David well with his ongoing healing process.
Get well soon, David. If you'd like to follow his ongoing recovery, we'll put a link to his Twitter feed in the show notes.
Lastly, I just want to remind our listeners that LSATMax has enabled LSATFlex mode for every released practice test in LSAT history. Just log into LSATMax from a browser, not the mobile app, and choose any practice test to begin. You'll have the option to test in standard LSAT mode or Flex mode.
For right now, LR will be doubled on LSATMax practice test, taken in Flex mode. So if LR is your strongest section, your PT scores in Flex mode will be higher than you can expect on the Flex test. But the team is working right now on an update that will weight all questions equally, which should give you a scaled score much closer to what you can expect on the LSATFlex. We'll send out an email to all students once that update is complete.
And that sounds like a good segue into our marquee topic for the day.
And that marquee topic is how to improve quickly on reading comprehension and logic games for students taking the May LSAT-Flex.
Right, and that's because, like the future update to our LSAT-Flex mode in LSATMax, on the real LSAT-Flex, logical reasoning will not be double-weighted. So, unlike the standard LSAT, it will account for 33% rather than 50% of your score, while logic games and reading comprehension each account for 33% as well. Now, if you're not a May test taker, keep listening. You can use some of these tips to improve your section scores too. But keep in mind that this episode is geared towards students with a short time left to study. If you're not testing until fall, adjust your personal study program accordingly. We'll talk about study schedules more generally in an upcoming episode.
All right, let's start with reading comprehension. Not many students' favorite, but it tends to have more questions than any other single section on the LSAT. We're probably expecting something like 27 RC questions, 23 logic games, and somewhere around 24 or 25 logical reasoning on the LSATFlex. So RC will be really important for May test takers.
Definitely. So if RC isn't normally your best section, here's how to get the most bang for your study time buck. First of all, I have a lot of students who struggle with the main point questions, and people tend to be a little embarrassed about this on RC because the main point is usually the very first question after each passage, and people feel like that should be the easiest question. I am here to tell you that is not true. Main point problems are very, very common, and the biggest reason that students struggle with main point on reading comprehension is that they don't understand what a main point is. A main point is simply the conclusion of the passage. This is exactly the same as doing an LR main point question. You're just looking for the conclusion of the overall argument. Many times students fall for trap answers that are in fact a conclusion of a particular paragraph of the passage rather than the overall conclusion of the passage. Make sure you're underlining all conclusions while you're annotating, but after you've done that, go back and figure out which are subsidiary conclusions and which is the main point of the passage. Any and all subsidiary conclusions in the passage should function to support the main point, or will simply be the conclusion of a perspective other than the author's, which the author will dismiss and then make their main point.
Yeah, and there's usually just one sentence in the passage that is the main point of the passage. I get a lot of students who think the main point is what the passage was about. And so they'll pick the one that covers the subject matter rather than actually covering the main point. But like I was saying, one sentence in the passage, and I think you can often, depending upon the subject matter of the passage, kind of have an idea of what is likely to be a conclusion or a main conclusion in a passage like that. So in a science passage, it's very common that the main point of the passage is a hypothesis or a causal statement. A hypothesis is just an explanation for some scientific problem that hasn't been found out yet. In social science passages and law passages, it's often a recommendation how society should be managed or how the law should be changed. And a lot of times it will have the word should or ought in it, because that's just what you conclude in those types of passages, how things ought to be. In a biographical passage, in an arts passage, a lot of times the main conclusion is an opinion, and usually it's an opinion about how great the artist or the author in question is.
Definitely. And, that reminds me of another of the kind of overall laws of reading comprehension. Just like Branden just said, the main point is always a single sentence in the passage. That kind of applies on a macro level to reading comprehension too. All of the answers are in the passage. They literally have to be. You can't be required to bring in knowledge that you have before you even take the LSAT in order to answer one of your reading comp questions. So anything that you need to know in order to answer any of the questions is in there. Very frequently, students look for the right answer in the answer choices, even though we know that 4 of those answer choices are traps. 4 of them cannot give you anything you want. There's only 1 out of the 5 answer choices that's good. So if you start hunting around in the answer choices for the correct answer before you really understand what it should be, you're making yourself susceptible to fall into a trap. Instead of doing that, after you read each question, go back to the passage and go back to your annotation. If you've annotated your passage correctly and you understand the structure, you at the very least understand the function and the argument of each paragraph, you should have a good idea of where in that passage you're going to find the answer of the question. Like, for instance, if you're looking for a perspective-based conclusion, say, you're comparing the perspective of humanists and rationalists, and you're looking for the humanists' conclusion. Well, look in the paragraph that gives the humanist stance, where they talk about their opinion, and look for their conclusion there. It's always in the passage. If you can find it there and then match what you found in the passage to the most similar answer choice, you're much more likely to get the question right than if you just go through the answer choices A through E and go, oh, well, this one sounds kind of right. This one sounds like it could be right. This one sounds like maybe wrong. Oh, this one sounds like a trap. No, I think this one is right. Doing that hunting around in the answer choices is basically just begging to get fooled if you do it before you understand from the passage exactly what you're looking for. You've got to go into the answer choices with a map.
And I think that brings up what's really important about reviewing. a lot of students, and this is true of all of the sections of the exam, you look at the question that you got wrong, you look at the answer choice that was the correct answer, and you say, okay, I understand, and then you move on. Well, that's not really going to help you going forward because you're going to get different subject matter next time. And so what you have to do as you're reviewing is to figure out what was the structural point that you missed, because each question is either testing your understanding of argument structure or it's testing passage details, and they test things in the same way over and over and over again. So what you should do as you're reviewing the questions that you got wrong is to ask yourself, where in the passage was this? Did I tag it? If I did not, how will I make sure that I tag it next time? In other words, how is it part of a common piece of passages that shows up over and over again? Because they're never testing you on anything new. They're just testing you on the same thing with different subject matter. So make sure you know where it was in the passage and that you know how to avoid making that mistake again next time you see something like that.
Absolutely. And one of the other most common mistakes that I see that you can go back and look at when you review your errors after taking an RC section or a full practice test is that many students miss the difference between overall questions about the passage and point of view questions. So generally, your main point question is going to be an overall question. In other words, what is the conclusion of this passage? What is the main point of the whole thing you just read? But that doesn't mean that that's the only perspective you're going to be asked about, especially when you have passages that have 2 or even 3 different perspectives, perhaps 2 or 3 groups in a particular scientific discipline, 2 or 3 adversarial political points of view. Very frequently, we get arguments about approaches to the law, different perspectives on whether or not criminal justice should be punitive. You might get asked a question that is actually from the point of view of a group or party that is not the author of the passage, someone that is maybe mentioned in the passage, even if the author of the passage actually disagrees with them. So look for those cues, things like, according to the humanists mentioned in the passage, or which of the following is most likely to be true according to the law and literature movement, according to the critics mentioned in the passage, any of those according to, from the perspective of, according to the argument of, that's a cue that you are going into a POV other than the author. Very often students miss these when they come right after an author's attitude question, something about the author of the passage is most likely to believe which of the following. Be prepared to shift your point of view within the passage. You've got to be able to see things from all sides.
That's a great point, and that's what I think separates logical reasoning from reading comprehension. They are very much alike in that they're pretty much testing the same thing, but with reading comprehension, you're going to get multiple arguments very often. And as Jelena was pointing out, you're going to get points of view from people who are not the author, and as much as they might be important people to their parents or their friends, the important person in the passage is the author. And so you have to be really particular as you're going through the passage, what piece of an argument am I reading right now? And who is the proponent of that piece of the argument? So I think a good recommendation, and I don't know that you can do this on test day because it can end up taking a little bit of time, but I think it's great for your untimed practice in the short term, which is each paragraph has an argumentative purpose. And so it's your job, and I think you should at the end of each paragraph as you're practicing slowly, say, what were the pieces of the argument that I saw in this paragraph? Arguments generally, or the things that get tested very often on the LSAT, are conclusions, premises that support those conclusions, and criticisms. And so you have to know who is the person who's advancing a particular conclusion. Is it the author? Is it a different person in the passage? Who is the person who's advancing a criticism? And if you answer those 3 questions, is there premise, conclusion, or criticism in this paragraph? And if you know who is making each one of those things, then you should be prepared for most of the argument structure questions that come at you.
Now, like Branden just mentioned, there are huge similarities between LR and RC. So this little tip is for those of you who are strong on LR and who are disappointed that LR is not going to be 50% of your score on the LSAT-Flex. you can actually use those LR skills to do most of what you're doing on RC. Definitely keep in mind what Branden just said about different perspectives and parts of the argument, but as far as the actual questions you're dealing with, every single RC question is actually just an LR question in disguise with a longer stimulus, a great big stimulus with potentially multiple points of view in it. You have strengthen and weaken questions. You have tons of must be true. You have argument structure. You have methods of argumentation. Like, this is all just basically LR with a gigantic stimulus. So as you're going through, if you're more comfortable with LR than with RC, just go to each question, think about exactly which LR question type it is similar to, and then take a moment and actually write that question type down next to it when you're doing your untimed practice, and then treat it as if it is an LR question. If RC intimidates you, treating it as giant LR might be a little psychological trick that you can use. It works for many students to make yourself feel more confident on RC so that you can then perform more competently.
I think that's a great idea, and I tell my students all the time that the questions on reading comprehension are just logical reasoning questions, always all the same. The one thing that is the big difference, obviously, is making it through the passages with enough time. And that, I think, is the brutality of reading comprehension, is that, and I think it's also the point of reading comprehension. The point is that there just is not enough time in 35 minutes to read through 4 passages and answer 27 or more possibly questions about it. And so I think for all of the sections, you have to have a timing strategy that you're going to execute on test day. But I think it's especially important with reading comprehension. Some people are just never going to get through all 4 passages. And so if that is your situation, then you might have to have a 3-passage strategy. If you are really able to rock 3 passages, and if you answer the same answer choice, doesn't matter which one, A, B, C, D, or E, on all of the questions on the passage that you skipped, you might get, 18, 19, 20 on reading comprehension without having done all 4 passages. But in any case, you have to be tracking your time. Usually passages 1 and 2 are a little bit more straightforward. And so if you're going to be doing all 4 passages, you should hopefully be banking time on those, meaning getting through each one in about 7 minutes. If you were to divide up a section into 4, it would be 8 minutes and 45 seconds for a passage. Obviously, you're not just going to do the same amount of time on each passage because there are harder and easier ones, but you really have to be keeping track of time. There are some students for whom, usually I recommend students in all sections of the exam try to do the easiest stuff first to pick up as many points as they're really going to get before they start reaching for those harder points and higher points. But it can be, and especially if you're going to attempt all 4 passages, it can be a good idea, at least for some people on reading comprehension, to start out with the hardest passages, which would mean more or less doing the section backward. That's because if you're doing the harder passage when you're fresh, before you've read through 3 passages frantically and answered a bunch of questions about them, that may be better because you'll be addressing a more straightforward passage once you're exhausted than addressing the really hard passage once you're exhausted. All of these things, timing, are things that you have to think about. And again, you have to have a plan that you are going to execute on test day. And I think just moving through the passage and hoping for the best is not really a plan.
Definitely. That's a big part of the LSAT overall, is just, can you have a plan and execute it? It's not just about, are you naturally good with logic? Are you naturally a fast reader? Those are the kind of things that you may not be able to change with study. I mean, I talk to my students all the time about how your reading speed is really the one thing that is pretty much set when you're an adult, that unless you go through maybe spending several months taking speed reading courses, you're probably not likely to dramatically change your reading speed before your LSAT. But you can dramatically change your plan. So moving to a particular type of passage, though, I did want to bring up the comparative reading passage briefly. That's that 2-perspective passage where you get 2 shorter passages rather than a single one, where they're likely to be on the same topic, but in general, they are not directly answering each other, not generally aware of each other. They're simply excerpts of some sort of longer discussion of the same topic. And I do want to point out that just like all of your long RC passages, you have to annotate your conclusions, your parts of your argument, all of the stuff that Branden was talking about earlier. But there is one more step that you don't want to miss on comparative reading. And this is something that I see people dropping points on all the time on that comparative reading passage. Annotate your points of agreement and disagreement. When you see those two little mini passages agreeing with each other, you can make a mark at the exact place where the same subject or the same argument is made in both passages, and same thing when you see them disagree. Now, with the digital LSAT, there are various different ways to do that annotation. Do what works for you, but make sure that you are tagging it. Whatever you do, don't skip that part, because then when you get to the questions, just like Branden was just saying about timing, you want to be banking time, not burning time. And you're going to burn time if every time you get an agree-disagree question in the question section of your comparative reading passage, then you're going to be burning time going back into each of the passages and looking for that agreement or disagreement, when you could actually just have been annotating it as you read the second passage. By the time you're reading the second passage, you've already read through the entire first passage, so you're not going to really spend that much more time going back up to the first passage and annotating the points of agreement and disagreement.
Yeah, and like Jelena was saying, as you're noting those areas of agreement and disagreement, that's very important, but it can also help you as you are eliminating answer choices. And I'm a huge fan on all sections of the exam of getting very good at getting rid of answer choices that are not doing what the question is asking you. And with agree and disagree questions, one of the easiest ways to get rid of an answer choice is that a lot of times an answer choice is something that will only be addressed by one or the other of the passages. Well, the authors can't agree or disagree on something unless both of them talk about it. And so ask yourself, as you're going through answer choices, is this really in both passages? If it isn't, you don't even have to wonder about it. It's the wrong answer.
Great point. Great point. Yeah, this is true on the equivalent in LR too. I know we're not really talking about LR today because LR is now the redheaded stepchild of the flex test. But when you have those agree-disagree questions on LR, same thing. Most of the wrong answer choices are things that only one of the speakers actually mentioned. So my final thought here on RC is just do your anticipation when you can. It's not always going to be possible. It's not realistic for you to memorize the entire passage or to always be able to, even when you're exhausted and in a hurry, find the exact sentence that you're looking for in the passage. But whenever you can, take that extra beat after you have read your stimulus and your question stem and go back to the passage and find at least the closest thing that you can find to what you think the answer will be. At least take a stab at it. If you don't find it, then that's where exactly what Branden says about knowing how to eliminate the answers that are not doing the correct thing for the question comes in. But very often, if you have annotated your passage well, you've actually already got the answer to the question marked somewhere. If it's, say, the conclusion of one of the groups, if you're looking for which one must be true according to the passage, you've probably at least got a paragraph annotation that says where you're getting, traits of spider behavior. If you're looking for a must-be-true spider behavior trait, go to that paragraph. See if you can anticipate what the correct answer is going to be, or at least get kind of a vague picture of what kind of thing the correct answer will be in your mind. If it's simply, it's going to be some sort of spider fact that is from the point of view of evolutionary biologists. Even just having that in your head before you read the answer choices is going to set you in better stead than just reading through the answer choices before you think about what the answer will be.
Great point, and I don't think there's a better place to end our discussion on RC than that one.
So that is RC. All right, now let's move on to logic games, which I think all of you know, my personal favorite section. It kills me when people say they hate games. And usually when people hate games, it's because they're dropping unnecessary points on logic games. And that's because, just like with RC, they probably aren't going in with a solid strategy, and then they're ending up flailing their way through the test.
There are some super common and easily avoidable mistakes on this section. If you have the discipline to change your approach quickly, there's still time to improve before the LSAT-Flex. So let me give you my one thing that I give just about every student toward the end of the course who wants to improve on logic games. I'm a broken record on this. If you've had office hours with me before, you've heard me harp about it. I think scenarios are the key to logic games. And remember, scenarios are where you take one rule or one variable and you try out all of the ways that it could work. Once you've done that, you've created all of those setups. If you really have tried out all of the ways that it could work, then you have a roadmap of the game. Anything that could be true about the game, anything that works, must work in one of your scenarios. Conversely, anything that doesn't work in any of those scenarios is something that must be false. And so you've really mastered the game if you have done scenarios. Students push back on it all the time when I ask them to do scenarios or demand that they do scenarios because they say, well, this takes too long. And the fact is that if you don't practice it, sure, it does take too long. But the same types of things are used for scenarios over and over and over again on the LSAT. I think the most common ones are in a sequencing game when you have a block. They'll say something like A finishes the race immediately before B. Maybe there's just 2 or 3 or 4 places that block can go. Try all of them out. You might find that it starts to push a bunch of other things into place and becomes helpful. In a group game, very often a must-be together rule. They function kind of in the same way as those blocks and sequencing games that I was talking about, in that they take up a lot of room, they push things around. And so if you try, maybe A and C are always in the same group and there's only 3 groups, you might try out A and C in all 3 of those groups and you'll find out that some or all of your scenarios are pretty well filled in. And if there's no rule that looks like it's going to be good for scenarios, then I think your kind of catch-all should just be the variable that shows up in the most rules. Because if you have a variable that's showing up in a bunch of different rules, that means that depending upon how many places it can go, it might trigger a rule like every time you put it somewhere. And so trying out all of the ways that a particularly restrictive variable like that can work may crack the game open for you. And again, you might put in 4 or 5 minutes making scenarios, and that might pay off by making a couple of the questions that would take a long time take no time. So consider it, practice it. If you are having timing issues, again, even though you feel like it takes time on the front end, that might be your timing issue, that you're not creating scenarios.
People never believe me on that. I don't know if people ever believe you when you tell them this, but no. Until they try it, every single student is like, well, but if I do all of these scenarios, I'm going to run down the clock and have no time for the questions. And I keep telling them, you're going to need no time for the questions because you're going to have done all of the questions before you even read them by doing your scenarios.
Yeah, it's like, do you want to go into the fight with your bare hands, or do you want to spend a couple of seconds, finding a baseball bat before you go into the fight? Your choice.
As someone with a baseball bat under my bed right now, I think I can tell you how I would answer that one. Although, thankfully, the only time that I've ever had to actually answer my door with the baseball bat, what I thought was a burglar was actually 4 extremely fat raccoons.
Oh my gosh. Well, now do not try to break into Jelena's house. You will not survive.
No, you will both be hit with a baseball bat and attacked by extremely fat raccoons.
Oh my gosh. That sounds like a way to go.
I mean, it would make headlines. If you're looking to go viral, then break into my house. No, wait. I should not give people that advice. Someone will try it.
No.
Don't do that. Don't do that. You don't want to mess with my raccoons. They're in a gang. No, so before we get too off track here, although arranging raccoons on my porch might make a good logic game, there will be 4 raccoons on Jelena's porch. We might need more than 4, though. We probably need 5 or 6 or 7 raccoons for a good logic game. Like Branden was talking about on RC, it's all strategy. So the same thing applies. Where you might have a 3-passage strategy for reading comp, you might have a 3-game strategy for logic games. So this stuff about a 3-game or a 2-game or a 4-game strategy, a lot of it is actually about perspective and realism. When you are where May students are right now, or LSATFlex students are right now, you're a couple weeks out from your test, and you're not going to be able to study necessarily every single day of that time. You need at least a day or two of rest before the actual test. So the amount of time that you have to learn new things is very limited. What you can focus on is being very realistic about where you are right now and making the best possible strategy for where you are. So if you realistically are someone who can always complete 3 logic games in 35 minutes but can never complete 4, then you're going to go in with a 3-game strategy. Mathematically, this is better. I do the math with people. I have them try it. Every time it works better. If you can do as much as you can with close to 100% accuracy in the time that you need to do that, and then guess, just like Branden said on RC, just use the same letter every time. It doesn't matter. It's random on whatever you're not going to get through. So, think about it. If you can get 16 answers right, so about 100% accuracy on 3 games, and then you get 1 lucky guess on the 4th. If you have 23 questions, that's plus 17 minus 6, which is, that's not a horrible section for logic games. That's obviously, it's not what you're shooting for if you're trying to get into the 170s, but you can still get a pretty good score with minus 6 on logic games if you do well on the other sections. On the other hand, if you do all 23 questions, but you're only 70% accurate throughout, that's going to get you at plus 16 minus 7, so you're dropping 1 more question there. Not to mention, you're going to end up a lot more frenzied and stressed because you didn't have a plan and work your plan. You just rushed through and hoped for the best. And realistically, you're probably not going to be 70% accurate when you're rushing. If you're rushing, what's going to happen is you're not going to do your scenarios, you're going to miss deductions, and you might even diagram your rules backwards and make deductions that don't even exist, which can easily mean getting every single question on a game wrong. Don't be that person who goes back, reviews the test, redoes their logic game section if you're on a disclosed test, and realizes, oh my god, I diagrammed a conditional rule backwards and blew the entire game.
And don't forget, even with that game that you skip, if you have a 3-game strategy, you should still be able to get the elimination question correct, because you don't have to build a setup. All you have to do is to knock out 4 answer choices that violate a rule. And so if you save, the 60 seconds that it's going to take to address that question, you make sure you have time to bubble in the remaining answer choices on the game that you skipped. It's entirely possible to get 2 or 3 questions right on a game without actually having done it. So think about that. And jumping off with the idea of eliminating answer choices, and I think I said this a little bit earlier with reading comprehension, but again, it's true, if not even more true with logic games. There are 2 ways of getting the right answer, and one is just as good as the other. One is to find the right answer. The other is to knock out 4 answers that are clearly wrong. I find that with could be true and could be false questions, a lot of times it's easier to knock out wrong answers because, as you will remember, the wrong answer for a could be true question is something that must be false. The wrong answer for a could be false question is something that must be true. And must is a much less squishy concept than could. You can look, if something must be false, you can look at your diagram and say, that's not going to work in my diagram. I know that must be false. But when they're asking you what could be true and you see something and it says, I don't know, C finishes 3rd, and you look at your diagram and you think, well, it seems like that could be true. It's a lot harder to latch on to that because proving that something could be true, you have to create the hypothetical and make sure that it works. If you could knock out 4 answer choices that clearly must be false, that's just as good.
Definitely. And that's a trick that you can rely on when you get to the end of LG and you're tired. If you're starting to not entirely trust your deducing as much as you did on the first game where you weren't so worn out, using that process of elimination, even if you think you've anticipated the right answer, which hopefully for at least many of these questions you will, you can always pull that process of elimination out of your toolbox and use it to check yourself. Try not to rely on it on all of the questions, because it is slower to get to test 4 answer choices and cross them off than to anticipate and jump to the one correct answer choice. But that's a tool that you want to have in your toolbox, because if you just don't feel confident of an answer, you can always reassure yourself. Like, everything on logic games is absolutely provable. If you understand the game, you can prove. There is no room for ambiguity. You can prove by drawing a diagram, by using your scenarios, that your answer is correct. So you should never be feeling like you don't know if you answered correctly. Now, Branden touched on the elimination question, which, like you mentioned, is a question that you should be able to do on every game, whether or not you've even diagrammed it. But the reason that we don't recommend doing the elimination question before you diagram is because if you do it after you diagram, now this is for a game that you do intend to do, not a game that you're guessing on. Obviously, if you're going to guess on the rest of the game, don't do a diagram, just do your guesses. But if you are going to go through the whole game, that elimination question is a way to test your understanding of each rule. If you have made one of those big bloopers and diagrammed a rule incorrectly or just misunderstood what it means, most likely you're going to catch that when you do the elimination question. If you do it according to the correct method, which is to go through each rule in turn and go through the answer choices of the elimination question and eliminate any that violate that rule. If you do it that way, you're going to test your understanding of the entire game, because if you somehow end up with 2 answer choices left or with no answer choices left, then you've obviously misunderstood a rule. You need to take a beat, go back to the rules, and think, okay, did I reverse conditionality? Did I mistake a hate relationship for a love relationship? Did I draw an arrow and make myself think that something was conditional when in fact I'm on a hybrid game and that was actually an ordering rule and I was just so used to drawing arrows that I drew an arrow? Check your understanding with the elimination question before you go on to the other questions, and then you might save yourself one of those big bummer mistakes where you miss an entire game because you misunderstood a rule.
That's great advice. One more thing about eliminating answer choices, and then I will stop harping on eliminating answer choices. The makers of the LSAT serve you questions in an order that they like. That does not mean that that is an order that is good for you. And in fact, it kind of means that it's an order that's probably not good for you, because they like to throw up roadblocks. And this is one of the things you should try it out on a practice exam, see if it works for you, because I don't know that it necessarily works for everybody. But a lot of times I recommend that my students attack the conditional questions first in logic games. Those are the ones that start with if. The reason for that is that usually the way you address one of those conditional questions is to create a hypothetical. And if you have created a hypothetical and filled it in correctly according to the rules, you have found something that could be true about the game. And you can use those hypotheticals just like you can use your initial diagram and the scenarios that you make and the right answer to the elimination question. You can use those hypotheticals to test answer choices on other questions. The most common way this happens is that, like I said, when you filled in your diagram correctly, when you filled in a hypothetical correctly, you figured out something that could be true. Very often it will allow you to get rid of wrong answer choices to must be false questions. So if you did question number 17 and you filled it in and you determined that runner C finishes third in that hypothetical, and then it works, and they ask you on a different question, which one of the following must be false, and it says runner C finishes third, that's the wrong answer because it could be true. And they're asking you if it must be false. So that's another way of very quickly getting rid of wrong answers. It's far less likely that you will have the correct answer to another question, having made a hypothetical, but they very often will give you the opportunity to eliminate answer choices on different questions from the one that you created the hypothetical for.
Yeah, I used to be really against doing logic game questions out of order, simply because when we were on the paper test, I was worried about that creating a risk of simply bubbling the wrong row and ending up missing a question that you actually knew because you screwed up your bubbling. I got very traumatized on that one by one of my early tutoring students who bubbled one row lower than he should on reading comp after the third question and missed almost the entire section by bubbling one row too low. But now we're digital, so bubbling errors are basically impossible now. So now, yeah, if you want to go do all of your conditional questions before you do all of your absolute questions, hey, can't hurt, give it a try. And yeah, you might find that those additional hypothetical diagrams that you've drawn out answer your other questions. Although there are a lot of games where once you've done your scenarios, you've basically answered all of your conditional questions anyway, because frequently when games have a heavily scenarioized element to them, all of the questions are basically designed to test whether or not you understand the scenarios.
Yeah, I did that all the time, misbubbling, and I actually got to the point where I would have to, and obviously this is not relevant for our students taking the LSAT-Flex, so I'll move through this story quickly, but I had to develop a system where in my head, I was saying what was the answer as I'm looking at the page, then going over to my answer sheet and saying that again in my head. So I'd look at the page and I'd say 17 is B. Then I would go over to my answer sheet and say to myself 17 is B and then bubble it in. If I did not do that, I would always misbubble.
Yeah, so for the students out there who are bummed that they missed the opportunity to take the LSAT on paper, yeah, I do prefer doing RC on paper too. I get it. There are some advantages to paper, but hey, at least you missed bubbling errors. You got to skip that whole stage of your learning. Now, speaking of skipping things, one thing, if you are not 100% or close to it logic game score, and you are 2.5, 3 weeks out of your actual official LSAT, skip rule substitution questions. Almost all of them are huge time sucks, and very frequently these days, they are showing up as the last question of your first or second game, which didn't used to happen that often. And that's really there to slow you down. Now, if you are somebody who can realistically hope for 100% on 4 games in 35 minutes, which is not most LSAT students, there is a reason why the percentiles work the way they do. A 90th percentile score means you are better than 90% of the people taking the LSAT. Well, better at the LSAT, not objectively better. Very different things. Very, very different things.
Might mean you're substantially worse than other people. Possibly.
Yes, and substantially more annoying in conversations while you're studying for the LSAT. The number of students that I have had who have texted me that they had a fight with their significant other because in the middle of a relationship conversation, they called them out for reversing their sufficient and necessary conditions or for using a fallacy.
Yes.
Yes, no. But your score, if you are in the 99th percentile, is better than 90% of scores. So you know that 9 out of 10 students are probably not getting 100% on any section, much less on logic games, which has a very difficult time element. Unless you are one of those rare people, skip those rule substitution questions unless after glancing at them you already have a pretty good idea of what the answer is. Don't invest the time when you could do 2 or 3 questions on the next game in that time.
That brings me to my last and a kind of broader point that's on the same issue, which is just never get bogged down on a question. Any question on the LSAT is worth exactly as much as any other question is on the LSAT. If you are spending more than 2 minutes probably on any question on a logic game, you're doing it wrong, unless it's the very last question of the exam and you have the time to put into it. It can be really hard, and this was one of the things that I struggled with a lot. It can be hard to bail on questions that you're struggling with, especially if, it's not the last game and you feel like, well, I haven't gotten this question and I have to move on and then I have to come back. But again, time management is a huge, huge thing. And if you're spending 5 minutes on one question, even if you get that question right, if it prevents you from getting to 2 or 3 other questions that you would have gotten correct, you have still hurt yourself, even though you got the question right.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very much, I know how hard it is. I always want to know everything about a game, especially given that it is the section that I enjoy the most and that I feel is a treat when I'm going through a practice test. It's super hard to bail on a question, but if you gotta do it, you gotta do it. And this is why I really like the disclosed tests, because although May will not be disclosed, if you do take a disclosed test, at least you have that mental reassurance that if you bail on a question on the real test, you are going to get the test and be able to do it over and not have it nagging in the back of your head. Which I would.
Yes.
I'm still mad about the one RC question I missed on my LSAT. I still feel like in a court of law I could argue that one, but I understand why it was wrong.
Well, unfortunately, the makers of the LSAT just do not brook dissent.
No, if there was a process to request a hearing, I would have used it.
Yes, and they would have denied your request immediately.
So, last point on logic games before we move on. There are no new logic games. Same thing, Branden said this about RC. It's true of the entire test. There have been so many LSATs right now. There are, what are we up to? 90? Is it 90 or 91 released LSATs that we're up to?
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Somewhere around that. We're literally up to so many disclosed LSATs, and that's not counting the undisclosed ones that were LSAT instructors and we don't remember exactly how many there are. Like, they have made so many logic games now that they're not going to come up with a brand new type of deduction or a brand new question or a brand new form of game. Everything, even if it is drastically different in as many ways as they can possibly make it, it is still going to use elements of other games. They're all just, it's like they're taking apart their house of Legos and they're making another house with Legos. And they may have taken apart a house that was blue on the left side and yellow on the right side, and built a house that was yellow on the left side and blue on the right side. But it's still made out of the same exact Legos. So if you only do one thing to study logic games before the test, make it repeating games. Choose a set of 10 games, get a variety of types in there, get some ordering, get some grouping, get one of the Lost Boys in there, get a bunch of combo, like a primary ordering combo and a primary grouping combo, and then take those 10 games, do them 5 times each, go straight through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then review your mistakes, start again at the beginning, do them all over. When you repeat games, you start to notice that the elements that are in one game in that set are probably also in another. The types of deductions that are in one game are going to show up on the next practice test you do in another game. They're all just new combinations of old elements with a fresh skin slapped on them in the by way of the imaginary scenario that you're in. You might have a game about racehorses that is basically exactly the same as a prior game about clowns coming out of a clown car and has similar deductions, similar blocks, but they've just simply put a new subject matter on it to make you think it's new. There's nothing new under the sun of LSAT. They've done everything they can possibly do. So repeat those games, practice, 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 and even a brand new game you haven't done before will start to feel familiar.
So there you have it. It's not too late to boost your LG and RC scores before the Flex test. And frankly, most of those tips are good for students at any stage, as long as you have some basic exposure to these sections already.
Now, if you're brand new to studying right now, and I know we do have a few listeners who are early in their journey, I've heard from you guys in some of my office hours, save this episode and come back once you've at least been through the basic lessons on reading comp and logic games. We've used some terminology here that will not be familiar to completely new students who are maybe just starting to study for a fall or winter test this year. But as soon as you go through those basic lessons, then all of this will make sense. Come back and listen to this one.
We do have some final thoughts for you as you proceed towards the scary new LSATFlex.
Let's take a quick break and then dive into that.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
With coronavirus wreaking havoc all over the planet, we know what you're thinking.
Pandemic right here!
How will this affect my LSAT score?
At LSATMax, we've long been concerned about the potential for a global pandemic, which is why 100% of our courses are available on demand, unlike our Shit, what are the symptoms again?
Ooh, don't take an in-class course and run the risk of infection, or even worse, subpar LSAT prep instruction. Instead, quarantine yourself at home with your new digital BFF, LSATMax, as our 99th percentile instructors teach you how to ace the LSAT and avoid the scariest of all test results, a low LSAT score.
Since everything else you were planning to do has probably been canceled by now, download our free 5-star rated app and get started today with your coronavirus-free LSAT prep. Just search LSATMax in the App Store. We're back.
And now I think it's time to give students our final thoughts for the week before we turn them loose.
I do have a final thought. So the one part of LSAT preparation that I think most students ignore is taking care of their mental health.
What, like it's hard?
Studying for the LSAT can be demoralizing and isolating in the best of times, and the best of times, these ain't. Your best bet, I think, is to stay plugged in with people on the same path as you. So tune into LSATMax office hours this week if you're an LSATMax student. We're doing one every day for the month of April. Make sure to comment on the message boards. You can even find people to study with through a Zoom chat or other video conferencing applications. I know there are Facebook groups dedicated to studying for the LSAT where you might find some study buddies. And the LSAT Reddit is a pretty popular destination for people studying for the exam.
Really great point. Yeah, this is a hard time for everybody. We've been hearing from a lot of people who've had a lot more anxiety, who've been even having anxiety attacks that they maybe didn't have before the current global situation. So this is, very, very important to take care of yourself right now. And remember, the LSAT can always be taken again, but you can't get another you. So take care of you. There will be LSATs in the future. This is not your only opportunity to take it. This is not your only opportunity to go to law school. Take care of that mental health. You only get issued one brain.
Wise words.
So my final thought this week is probably not quite as compassionate, but it is about my favorite subject, my logic games section, specifically the Lost Boys games, aka those rare games that are not really about either ordering, grouping, or even a hybrid of the two. We didn't mention the Lost Boys earlier in our discussion of improving quickly on LG, because frankly, most students' priority in the next few weeks should be the most common game types. But I will leave you with one thought on the rarer games. Contrary to popular belief, you don't actually need any special skills or tactics to solve them. It's still the exact same process that you use on ordering and grouping. Identify your variables, come up with a simple visual representation of whatever you're being asked to do with them, symbolicate the rules, and make deductions and inferences. For example, if you get a circular game, you can usually treat it as a linear game that just happens to go in a circle. Draw out your blanks in a circle and proceed. If you happen to get an unusual game on your LSATFlex, just pause, take a deep breath, and figure out how to visually represent it on your scratch paper. You might have to draw a map, a circle, or just a list of possibilities. But there's always a way to use your existing solving skills, and in fact, once you get past the shock of something new, you might find the Lost Boys games to be easier than their mainstream counterparts.
And that's our show for today. Thanks for listening. We really appreciate all of your ratings and reviews over the past couple of weeks, too.
You can find all of our past episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also send us a question at podcast@testmaxprep.com or even record a short voice message at 310-893-6303.
You can also check out the show notes for links to further reading and resources from today's episode.
Until next week, stay hydrated, study hard, and remember, plenty of heroes carry a briefcase.